Do I dream of cougars? Yes, I do dream of cougars. And to be honest, most of the dreams happen either the night before I capture one or the night after I capture one, and I'm thinking about its well-being and hoping everything is fine, and or some like event of the day. So I do have dreams of cougars from time to time, and they're usually pretty cool.
Welcome back to the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast, where we share the stories and science of the remarkable Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. I'm your host, Kristen Kuhn. Panther, painter, mountain screamer, catamount, ghost cat, puma. These are just a few of the regional and colloquial names for an elusive carnivore that stalks the wilds of Greater Yellowstone. It's an animal many folks go their whole lives sharing habitat with without seeing even once in the wild. Here in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it is more commonly known as the mountain lion or cougar. Today, we are sitting down with Daniel Stahler of Yellowstone National Park. Dan is a wildlife biologist who has been working in the park for 25 years and, among many other things, serves as project leader of the Yellowstone Cougar Project. We discuss everything from how to confidently identify mountain lions to how they quietly reintroduce themselves to Yellowstone after being nearly hunted out of existence in the early 20th century, to how the Yellowstone Cougar Project keeps tabs on the park's few dozen cats today. And of course, Dan shares some memorable stories from his time in the field working hands-on with these magnificent animals and their mega cute offspring. So grab your house cat and curl up with us for episode 9 of the Voices of Greater Yellowstone podcast, Yellowstone's Resilient Cougars.
Well, it's great to be here with you today, Kristen. My name's Daniel Stahler, and I am a wildlife biologist for Yellowstone National Park. And I wear a number of different hats in that role. I serve as the project leader for the Yellowstone Cougar Project. I'm the project biologist for the Yellowstone Wolf Project, and I help manage the elk research program here. And I also serve as the Section 7 biologist for the park, which works with the Fish and Wildlife to do consultations for endangered species, so grizzly, lynx. Whenever there's a park project that might have impacts, we do mitigation and compliance, and I kind of provide some of that expertise for the park in that coordination with that agency. So, and I've been out here doing that since 1997 was when I first came here, but officially started working for the Park Service in 2002.
Oh, wonderful. So, busy guy, to say the least. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey getting to Yellowstone? So how did you find yourself as a wildlife biologist wearing all those many, many hats in Yellowstone?
So I was born and raised in Vermont, in the very northeast part of the state. We call it affectionately the Northeast Kingdom. It's this magical land that's this very rural part of the state, just south of the Canadian border, kind of in that transition between sort of the hardwood maple forest into the boreal forest. And, I grew up surrounded by dairy farms and thick forests and, just enjoyed my time in that area of trying to connect with nature. I was outdoors all the time with my brothers, playing in the woods, hunting and fishing. And I have pretty deep roots going back quite a few generations in that area. And growing up in Vermont, I was always interested in working with animals. Again, I was kind of surrounded by, cows growing up in dairy farm country. But whenever I could, I was trying to be out there looking for white-tailed deer or moose or bears or coyotes or whatnot. And I was definitely very deeply connected with nature in my childhood and kind of always dreamed of a day when I could work with animals. As a young child, I always wanted to be able to communicate with animals. That's a pretty common theme for young kids growing up in those sorts of places. I think probably like many others had a bout of, wanting to be a veterinarian and then kind of grew out of that area when I kind of realized really connecting with nature and wildlife was kind of my passion. I did my undergraduate degree at Middlebury College, and which is a small liberal arts school. And then when I graduated from Middlebury in '96, I kind of sought out my first wildlife job. And I really was fortunate because I was able to get a position as a technician on a wolf study in the Boundary Waters in Minnesota. And it was kind of a dream come true for me, just being able to get onto a program working with wildlife, but particularly wolves. And I loved wolves as a kid. I think I have a book from my parents when I was in the eighth grade about they inscripted. We hope you follow your dream to become a wolf biologist, and ended up following down that route. So I was pretty determined to kind of pursue my interests. And when I went to Minnesota, basically my job there was to trap and radio collar wolves in the boundary waters, and that was an incredibly valuable experience that kind of set the trajectory of my career in many ways. And that was a long-term study on wolves and moose and deer in the Superior National Forest, working with one of the top wolf biologists, David Meach, and then that linked me up to Yellowstone when I completed that job. And so I came out to Yellowstone National Park for the first time to work in 1997, about just a little over 25 years ago. And that was at a time where wolves had just, of course, been
Yeah.
reintroduced to the park. When I showed up, we still had a handful of wolves in the pens that we were feeding. And I got right in on the ground when the research was starting up. So I showed up in 97, became a technician, volunteer technician, and became one of the first graduate students working on the Wolf Project. I ended up studying for my master's degree ravens and their relationship with wolves. And that was kind of a big question is, bringing wolves back to a place like Yellowstone, what was going to be their impact on the ecosystem? And I was particularly interested in that connection to the scavenger guild. And so I did my master's degree through the University of Vermont, actually, because I worked with a gentleman named Bernd Heinrich, who was doing a lot of great raven research at the time. And he became my advisor. He's a pretty well-known natural history writer as well. And I connected with him, did my field work in Yellowstone, and was able to get my master's degree doing that. And then right after I finished that in 2000, I got the opportunity to work on the Yellowstone Cougar Project. And that was at the time led by the Hornacher Wildlife Institute, transitioned into the Wildlife Conservation Society that became the folks running that Cougar Project. And I worked for this incredible biologist. Her name was Tony Ruth. She was a great mentor, just an incredible biologist that taught me a lot. And I worked for that program under Tony for about a year and a half. And then the position for the Park Service as the project biologist for the wolf program opened up in 2002. And so I was hired for that. And so that brought me to Yellowstone and kind of I haven't left ever since. So
What an incredible story. You've, like you've been saying, have worked with an incredible array of animals already and some of the really iconic heavy hitters of our area. But today we're going to hone in on the cats because we
yes,
do want to talk to you about mountain lions. And we know that these animals have a lot of names. Mountain
yes.
lions, cougars, catamounts, pumas, ghost cats, the list keeps going. What do you call them, and why do you think they have so many different names?
So I admittedly interchange their common names here as well. The title of our research project is called the Yellowstone Cougar Project, and I think many of us working with them in this part of the country in the Rocky Mountain West would refer to them as cougars, or other also more commonly mountain lions. They once in a while I'll just say lion or cat, but cougar is a pretty typical name. And in fact, they have the Guinness Book of World Record for the most common names for a species.
Oh, no
Um,
way.
yeah, and of course, there's a lot of names that you just mentioned, and but there's a lot of indigenous native cultures names as well, and their respective languages to identify these animals. The scientific name is Puma concolor. It used to be Felis concolor, but in 1995 they switched the genus to Puma concolor.
Interesting.
And the word concolor, the species name, the Latin for that is of uniform color. And that kind of describes that, unlike other of the big cats or medium sized cats, they're not spotted other than the young of the year. Um, and they're kind of that nice uniform, sort of tawny brown, reddish brown. And so that kind of, and they are that wherever they're distributed. Historically, they are the most widely distributed terrestrial mammal in the Western Hemisphere. They
Wow.
range all the way historically from the Yukon of Canada all the way to the tip of South America. We all think of wolves as being very widely distributed around the world, which they are, circumpolar distribution, and of course southern areas as well. But the cougar, really, in the Western hemisphere, is the king of that distribution. So, because of that, if you think of human cultures connecting with this animal. They're and many cultures are exposed to them, so they have their own names for them, and that kind of explains that that large variety of common names that we attribute to them. But the puma, people are like, what, is it a different species, and
Hmm.
why do you call it this? It's sort of a regional naming system. So.
Gotcha. And do you see any variances in the cats as they are distributed across the hemisphere? Are there subspecies, or do you see any regional kind of adaptations, or is it pretty much the same critter up and down?
You do see different subspecies and different distributions and features that kind of relate to them. I mean, they all are pretty uniform. I think if you get down into South America and look at some of those cats down there, they tend to have some slightly different sort of morphological distinction that you'll see. And then you'll look at a cat from a Florida Panther, and you kind of look at its overall body shape, and they're kind of sometimes seem lankier and thinner and a slightly different proportion, but compared to a cougar in Yellowstone. I think cats into the more into the northern part of their distribution that deal with more winter climate, their fur can take on a slightly different sort of characteristic to deal with the colder elements. But in general, they're pretty similar looking everywhere, everywhere you see them. So.
And actually, this is a perfect segue because I know that a good number of other alleged mountain lion sightings turn out to be other cats, other felids, bobcats commonly. So, how can someone tell if the animal they're looking at is truly a cougar as opposed to a bobcat or just a really healthy house cat?
Yeah, great question. I mean, they, compared to those other felids that you just mentioned, they are larger. I think one of the very obvious characteristics of seeing a cougar is the long tail. It's about two-thirds the length of the body, and they, have an overall long body. I think in general, cougars are a lot smaller than people think. We often like to sort of exaggerate the carnivores in our world, the huge cougar that roams out there, or the giant wolf. And so people have always told me that they saw, no one ever sees a small cougar, they all see a large cougar, right? Whether it's a hunter or someone, it's always like 300 pounds. And
Uh-huh.
and compared to those other felids, they are larger. They're about I'd say about 30 inches. An adult male will be about 30 inches at the shoulder, so maybe not as tall as people think they are, so they're not as large in mass and not as tall, but certainly compared to a bobcat, which has the shorter tail, a lynx has the shorter tail. Your house cats are just significantly smaller. But just the other day, we had someone report some mountain lions out in a part of the northern range of Yellowstone. It ended up being a sighting of some marmots. So, it's
Oh,
easy to get, that was through a scope way in the cliff band in the distance. So, people get excited and can kind of create the image of what they want to see. But another really common characteristic of these animals is just they're incredibly muscular. They kind of look like bodybuilders, and you compare that to, let's say, another top predator here in Yellowstone, like the wolf. Wolves are muscular too, but like the dog, they tend to be more lanky. I mean, cougars are just, you look at a cougar, it doesn't matter if it's a female or a male, and it just looks like they got back from lifting weights at the gym. And they're just bulging muscles on their forearms, a really muscular tail that's corded and powerful. They use that as part of their movement and their balancing, counterbalancing. And that muscular nature to them is really key to them as an ambush stalking predator. So very powerful. They do have that, again, like their scientific name suggests, that uniform brownish color. So yeah, the long tail, the uniform brown, tawny brown reddish body color, very muscular forearms and hindquarters and tail, muscular head. And of course, that varies between male and female, but that's kind of your overall basic description of them. Yeah.
great. Well, thank you for that. That's really
Yeah.
helpful. So pretty hard to differentiate from a marmot, I'd say, based on that
Yes.
description.
Yes.
So, what can you tell us about just the cougar's life cycle? Just tell us
Hmm.
a bit about what it means to be that animal.
Yeah, yeah. So, we kind of think of the cougar, we describe them as being a solitary carnivore. I think that depiction needs a little bit of nuanced, framing, because, yes, unlike wolves, they don't live in packs or large family groups. Females and males have a slightly different life history, and that is the mating system of a cougar is that the males will come together only to join up with the females to breed. They spend a couple days together. They copulate. If it's successful, the female then has kittens. The male leaves and plays no role in raising those offspring. And so the female cougar is sort of the ultimate single mom that basically does all the work to raising these young kittens. And these kittens are, after about a 92-day gestation period, are born. One thing that's interesting about cougars, again, I kind of comparing a lot with wolves just because I find the contrast interesting because they're both here together. Female wolves have an estrus cycle once a year. It's typically in this area of the country, is usually in February. A female cougar will actually cycle about once every 28 days. So they
Oh
can
my
theoretically
goodness.
get bred at any time of the year. And again, after that 90 some odd day gestation period, can produce a litter of kittens of anywhere between 1 and 4, up to 5 or 6 in rare cases. And so what we do see are birthing pulses, though, where females tend to give birth to kittens in the summer months. May, June, and July is very common here in Yellowstone. We've had litters of kittens born in the middle of the winter, but they are typically born in the summer months, and that probably overlaps at the time when food resources are more readily available to a mother. She has a lot of energy expenditure to lactate, to feed those kittens milk, and then eventually meat. And so having kittens in May, kind of timing it when you get elk calf neonates or deer fawn neonates, which are those firstborn fawns and calves of the year, is really key for her to be successful feeding those growing offspring. The male goes off and does his own thing. Another distinction between them is how they use space and home ranges. We describe female cougars as not necessarily having territories that they actively defend from other females, but home ranges that they use for space to raise offspring, to hunt, and that often overlaps with other female cougars. Often they're relatives, daughters, sisters, but not always. And those home ranges, at least in Yellowstone, are approximately 250 square kilometers, and males have up to twice the size. We tend to describe mountain lion or cougar males as having territories because they do actively defend those from other males, and they're larger and tend to overlap multiple females' home ranges because males are really concerned about having space that holds multiple females that they can control breeding opportunities for, and they will keep other males out. New males will come in and challenge them. They fight to the death at times. You do have infanticide, where a new male coming in might kill kittens. We know of this. We're familiar with this with other species, whether it's bears or African lions, is commonly thought of with infanticide, and that is thought to again, because of the cycle of females, kick them into an estrus cycle again and breed and produce kittens of their own with those females. So those are some basic differences there in terms of just the general patterns of a year-round life cycle. Young kittens will stay with their mothers up to 2 years of life.
Oh
Average
wow.
dispersal is around 18 months. It can happen anywhere between 12 months and 24 months typically, but it's usually somewhere in between. The first and the second year, those kittens are then become subadults, and then they leave off on their own. You tend to have females stay closer to home, shorter dispersal. Males that leave their mothers tend to have longer range dispersal, and that's to avoid inbreeding with their mothers and sisters. And that's a very common behavior of male bias dispersal or female bias dispersal, depending on the species we're talking about. But that's how it usually works with cougars. That said, we've had some of our female cougars move quite far and disperse out of Yellowstone. We had one of our collared females who was born and raised right here outside of Gardner on Mount Everett disperse and head over to Hebgen Lake, and then make a trip all the way back to the Northern Range, and then decided, no, I like it out there. And then she headed back out and settled in the Madison Valley just south of Ennis. So that's kind of a longer range movement. We've had some males go really far. And of course, you hear of stories of these really long range dispersals. The famous one, I think it was back in 2011, of a male that went from the Dakotas all the way to Connecticut and was hit by a vehicle
Oh my
on the road
gosh.
in Connecticut. And I think that's among one of the longest dispersal distances of a terrestrial mammal. So it's pretty varied there. But yeah, that kind of describes the basic sort of family structure. So back to what I was saying about being solitary or not. So you think of a female cougar, she's rarely solitary. She's pretty much with offspring most of her life, because once they produce a litter of kittens and they leave mom, she usually then cranks out another litter of kittens if she's a good mom and has good resources. So they are often living in little groups of cats, little packs of cats. And then we also document, cougars coming together and sharing kills, males and females associating with one another, spending time together, of course, for breeding. And we see this with our GPS collar data. We see this with our remote camera data of multiple cats coming together. I think they're a little more social than people realize, always searching their environment for new information from who's out there. Are they a friend? Are they a foe? Are they a relative or not? Are they a potential mate? Are they a potential competitor? Their social relationships, I think, are richer than we maybe have previously appreciated.
Yeah. I think we're going to talk a little bit later about the Yellowstone Cougar Project in more depth, but how many collared cats do you guys have?
Right now, we just have four collared individuals,
Okay.
with four GPS collared individuals. We lost several last year to a range. We lost one to was killed by a pack of wolves. One drowned in the river actually, and
Oh,
another one
wow.
left the park and was harvested. Was killed during a hunt. So natural causes of death. We actually had an accidental death. I just remembered of another one that actually got stuck in a rock pile. We think she was trying to reach down and get a marmot or something, and her leg got caught and it broke. And she was in a boulder fell on her and it pinned her there. So I mean, they really face a lot of
Yeah.
challenges out there in their daily lives. It's a hard living. So right now we only have four, but we can talk a little bit about this later if you'd like. But just the history of the Yellowstone Cougar Project through time has shifted from intensive radio collaring, and that has to do with technology and methods for counting cougars, which is a big part of our objective, to newer technologies and techniques such as non-invasive genetic surveys, remote cameras, and we've decided purposefully to kind of back off the more heavy-handed radio collaring that earlier cougar studies have really needed to do in order to get the information they were seeking. And now we can really take advantage of different technologies. We still rely on GPS collars to answer certain questions, are invaluable to that, but we try to balance it with collaring animals, which is a ton of work. There's always safety issues for people and animals, and plus we work in a national park, so we try to limit our sort of direct handling of animals and collaring. That said, research objectives sometimes really call for that sort of technology application.
For sure. But it must be nice to have even more tools in your toolbox now.
It really does. It really
Mhm.
does. Yep, for sure.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about the role that cougars play in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem and, perhaps even what this place would look like without them.
Yeah, yeah. So, there's been so much attention over the last couple decades to wolves, and rightly so. They really it was a big deal to bring them back to these landscapes. But we forget that there was this other top predator there on the landscape as well. Cougars and wolves share a very similar history in Yellowstone. They were both eradicated, in terms of a viable population by the 1930s. Cougars crept back in on their own, and that happened probably sometimes during the 70s. And there's a couple reasons we can talk about what drove that change. But their importance in these landscapes are a top predator, and we know that predation is an incredibly important ecological force. It's shaped life on Earth for millions of years, and the role of top predators on ecosystems like Yellowstone can't be underappreciated. Through their process of killing prey, they really play a key role in how ecosystems function, primarily through food web dynamics, the transition of energy from a predator when it kills that large ungulate, like an elk, for example. That energy that then ripples through that food web has very many links. And we know from studying food web history and ecology, the more links you have in a food web, and there are many in Yellowstone, the more stable those ecosystems can be. I mean, we use the word, balanced and healthy. Balance is sort of, I think, it's sort of a term of the past when we talk about ecology. There really isn't the balance of so-called balance of nature as much as, these ecosystems are dynamic, they change, but food web dynamics underlie them. And the more links you have, the more stable and, sure, healthy, we can use that term, they are. So cougars are that direct predation link that really influence that food web dynamic by transitioning energy throughout it. So the energy goes through not only themselves and their offspring, but to all the scavenger guild, the ravens, the eagles, the magpies, the grizzly bears or the black bears that might get the food from a cougar kill, and then through their nutrient cycling all the way down into the soil microbes and the invertebrate communities, and that all trickles back into the landscape through plant growth and nutrients. So it really shapes and influences a lot of things through that top-down influence. We talk about top-down predation influences on food webs and bottom-up, right through primary productivity of plants feeding herbivores. So predators are very much at that, and so the cougar does play that significant role here in Yellowstone.
Okay, wonderful. So you mentioned that they were extirpated from Yellowstone but managed to kind of reintroduce themselves to the park. So can you tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so there's this really fun history of the cougar in Yellowstone that links to, someone that we all are familiar with, and his link to conservation. That's Teddy Roosevelt. He actually came to Yellowstone in the early 1900s with the goal of hunting a cougar in the park. This is at a time. This was around the early 1900s, and he recognized that that would probably be controversial. He came to Yellowstone and actually saw that was at a time when the predators had largely been eliminated, particularly wolves. And so he was seeing large amounts, abundance of elk that he came during some particularly tough winters that were starving. And then he sort of recalibrated his view on cougars. He initially thought of the cougar as being this lacking courage and, bloodthirsty. And then, once he got to learn about these animals a little bit more, through hunting them outside of the park and other places and appreciating them more, he kind of changed his tone, and he actually asked for the banning of cougar eradication in Yellowstone in 1908. Now that didn't quite get followed because predator eradication continued after he established that, but it is an interesting story about his connection to Yellowstone and cougars specifically. But yes, like wolves, they were more or less eradicated by the 30s. There was bounties on them. There was actually a park directive to remove predators from public lands
Right.
in Yellowstone and the surrounding areas, and they were quite successful. With cougars in particular, hounds to this day are a very effective way to kill cougars. Poisons were applied for sure, and that affected many species, wolves, coyotes, bears, the scavengers, cougars to a certain degree as well. But certainly the bounties and the directed hunting using hounds was a key part of that removal for cougars. And remember, cougars have evolved with wolves, and the response when you're chased by a canid for if you're a cat is to go up a tree,
Right.
and that's become an effective way to hunt cougars. We use that same technique to radio collar them actually. So, but that was quite successful. Now, through the late 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, there was probably some cougars roaming around a little bit. I mean, really throughout the West, cougars took a big toll because of the bounties. But they live in very remote, wild places, and they probably all were not killed. But we believe that Yellowstone just simply did not have a functional cougar population. When I say functional, ecologically functional, there weren't enough of them to play a role as a predator that we see today, for that period between the 30s and through the 60s. Sometimes in the early 70s is when we think they started coming back. And the reason for that is that was around the time that the states in the West and other parts of the country got rid of the bounties on cougars. They recognized there was actually a group of constituents, and these are houndsmen, that wanted to see cougars out there. They wanted to chase them. They didn't have them out there anymore, and so they advocated to have them become a trophy game managed animal. And simultaneous to that, we were seeing deer and elk populations coming back because of management as well. And so it became this sort of combination of actually controlling the take of cougars through hunting and regulation that helped bring them back. To this day, the houndsman communities are probably some of the biggest advocates for cougar conservation. That's, I think, important for people to understand, as they play a pretty key role in the conservation of cougars to this day. But they crept back into the Yellowstone probably in the 70s, and we believe established a population by the 1980s in terms of a resident year-round population.
Okay, so let's revisit the Yellowstone Cougar Project. So you've mentioned it
Mhm.
a few times throughout, but can you give us a little bit more of a backstory and then just describe really what that entails? I know you're project leader, so I assume you have all the information.
Sure, sure. So the Yellowstone Cougar Project, I would say, officially started back in the 80s. There was an initial survey here, 1982, somewhere in that era, that was kind of the first attempt to document an established population. It was largely through snow tracking surveys. There was no collaring, radio collaring, or anything. It was just, do we have cougars here? And then in 1987, at the time, a young biologist named Kerry Murphy, he went on to have a really long career here, both starting in Yellowstone and moving down to the Forest Service down into Wyoming. And he, for his doctoral degree, was sort of the first real focused study on cougars, and that kind of started the Yellowstone Cougar Project. And between 1987 and 1994 is what we would think of as sort of phase one of Yellowstone Cougar Project, and that was prior to wolf reintroduction. The goals there were very similar to what we do today, and this how many cougars are in the park, what's their distribution, and what are their predation patterns and their food habits. And with that came very involved radio collaring. That at the time, the technology available to study cougars was really being driven by radio telemetry. They did not have GPS collars at the time. It was simply a collar that emitted a beacon. That one had to go out. First, you had to catch a cougar, and then you put the collar on, and then you follow it. So, and I can talk about catching cougars and the challenges there. But they caught a lot of cougars during that era. They worked with some local houndsmen, dedicated dogs that are well trained to pursue find cougar tracks. Of course, the human helps find the track, and then the dogs, of course, using their amazing sense of smell, will track that cat. And the goal of treeing the cat, in which the biologist can then dart the cat with immobilization drugs and climb up and lower them to the ground and fit them with a radio collar and let them go. And that was the primary goal. And they tried to collar as many cougars as they could find to really figure out how many were out there. I mean, think about how many times you've seen a cougar, Kristen, in the wild. And so then think about how difficult it would be to actually count cougars on the landscape and estimate their population size. So that really was the best tool at the time to do it. And to this day, it really is an effective tool as well. We have new tools that I'll talk about. And so Kerry Murphy's work, he collared a lot of cougars between 1987 and 1994. And he basically came in and was able to document that increasing recolonization of Yellowstone National Park by that species. And then from his studies on their predation patterns, what they would do is you follow a cougar, you locate them every day, you take a bearing, you mark a location, and you hang a little flag, and you leave, and you come back the next day. And if the cougar left, you go and find that cougar the next day and do the same thing. If the cougar didn't leave and it's in the same spot for a couple days in a row, you triangulate that based on your bearings of the signal. And then once that animal leaves, you go in and hopefully find prey remains. And that was the main way that they could document what they were feeding on. And they used all that radio calling data to estimate the population size. And that was at a time when we're talking about in the teens to low 20s during that era of cougars, because they were just establishing themselves. And I first should explain what Yellowstone's cougar habitat is like. The year-round resident population of Yellowstone cougars is in the northern part of the park, what we call the Northern Range. Northern Range, of course, is characterized by that winter range of the migratory ungulates, the elk, the bison, the deer, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, all come here to the northern part from other parts of the park in the summer. It's the best year-round habitat. The Northern Range has been the focus. It's characterized, of course, by open grasslands and sagebrush communities mixed with forest. Cougars in particular are known to be in those really steep, rugged habitats. The Yellowstone River, that of course comes up to the Northern Range, leaves Canyon Village in the interior and shoots north and makes that hard bend where it meets with Lamar Valley and then cuts here into the town of Gardner and then moves on north. That is the heart and soul of cougar country in Yellowstone. We call it the Black Canyon of the Yellowstone. If you've ever hiked between, anywhere between Hell Roaring and Gardner, you are hiking through some of the best cougar habitat in maybe the lower 48, or anywhere. And so it's just that is kind of our main area. So that's where our research is focused. So Kerry did his work. That ended in 1994. Then in 1998 through 2006, Tony Ruth led the study, again, Hornacher Wildlife Institute / Wildlife Conservation Society. And she led that effort. We refer to that as phase two. And that was a wonderful, elegant study because it was able to compare and contrast pre-wolf and post-wolf what are the effects of when you restore the other top predator to the landscape? How did they compete? Did they coexist? Did wolf recovery cause cougars to decline? Did it change their food habits? And then Tony, again, because the technology is available to her, continued with that heavy radio collaring effort. They tried to collar, up to 80% at any time of the population, snow tracking surveys, collaring that really allowed them to come up with good population estimates between those two phases. And that study ended in 2006. Towards the tail end of her study, new technologies like GPS collars were starting to become available. When I first worked on that study in 2001, we were still doing that old school predation sequences where you'd go out every day and locate the cougar. You wouldn't try to see them. I mean, the whole goal was not to disturb them and bump them from the kills, but you're trying to get really accurate locations and triangulate and come back the next day and search. And that was the way we studied their food habits. Now we just use GPS collars, which are just fantastic. So that work ended, and her work was great because it essentially showed us that the cougar population was continuing to increase. And that's because there's just abundant food. I mean, we still had the northern elk herd at this time was abundant and rich. And yes, sure, it was on the decline. It's important to talk about what caused that decline and where we're at today. But basically, there's still enough food and enough space for wolves and cougars to coexist. And she continued to see an increase in cougar population size from her work. So her study ended in 2006. And then there was about an 8-year gap in anything having to do with cougars. We, the Wolf Project, would continue to kind of track and opportunistically get info, but rarely did we see cougars. We weren't looking for them. We'd cut their tracks. We'd occasionally have a sighting, but there was no focused research anymore. In 2014 is when I started back up what I guess you could think of as phase 3 of the Yellowstone Cougar Project. And we just decided it was time to really understand how the community ecology of carnivores, a multi-carnivore system. Tony had done a great job carrying off what Kerry Murphy did, but since no one else was doing it, we have to keep this work going, and it's important because at the time there was so much focus on wolves, and wolves are doing this. Wolves are trophic cascades, and they're causing the elk herd to decline. We really needed to reach out to the public and educate and say, no, this is a multi-carnivore system. There's a lot of factors that are influencing ungulate population dynamics, competition, and coexistence. And we can't just not ignore cougars. And I think too often they were being ignored in terms of their role in this system. So we started the study back up in 2014. This was at a time now when molecular techniques, such as being able to genotype a hair sample or a scat, were becoming more commonly used for these secretive sorts of carnivores. There's these efforts with wolverines and other secretive animals where sort of these non-invasive snow tracking surveys, finding hair or scat or blood left behind, and being able to send those to a lab and genotyping them to come up with unique genotypes, which is a signature of an individual from their genetic code, their DNA, were becoming more readily available, readily to use. So we really embraced that. We came up with an estimate in that 2014 to 2017 of approximately 34 to 42 cougars, depending on the year. And that's all age and sex classes. And that doesn't sound like many, but given their home range size, it's a robust, healthy population that comes up to a density. It's very common for cougar studies to use a similar density, and that's like about 2 cougars per square kilometer or per 100 square kilometer. And so that's about 2 cougars per just under 40 square kilometers, and that's a pretty consistent density from where Tony Ruth was at. It's very similar to densities we see in other cougar studies that are being done in the Rocky Mountain West. So it indicates a healthy, stable cougar population. And so that's kind of how we've done that. And now we're using remote cameras. And that's like with genetic samples left behind, we can put a handful of collars out on individuals, the GPS collars, and we put little markings on their collars so they show up either at night, infrared on the infrared cameras. They have a little glow. The animal doesn't see it, but we see it on the camera. And so we can identify individuals that hit our cameras. And so what that then becomes is like a genetic sample. You collect a hair from a specific location on the landscape. You could say individual A was here, and we found and detected individual A X number of times, and you can extrapolate out their home range size, and that gives you this estimate of how many cougars are distributed over a certain unit of area. The cameras do the same thing. We can recognize individuals from their collars, and that feeds into these same modeling techniques. We call them spatially explicit mark recapture methods, or there's different variations of that, and those become pretty robust ways to estimate population abundance. So now we're taking advantage of remote cameras. along with our GPS collars. And our GPS collars are used for predation studies. We use the GPS movements to look at their interactions with wolves and bears and how they overlap together. We look at how elk are responding to predation risk by cougars by comparing our GPS collared elk with our GPS collared cougars and wolves. So we're doing all this really wonderful stuff using these cutting edge technologies. Um, but the remote cameras are wonderful because we get high definition video clips that really can show us the world of cougars that are just so difficult for people to see in the wild. And I can sit here and talk about the science of cougars forever. And I could show you a 20-second clip of a cougar and you'll just be inspired and mesmerized by them on camera. So that's kind of our combination of techniques we're using today. So.
Amazing. Amazing. Okay, so I have a couple follow-up questions for you on that. First, do you think that cougars being a particularly elusive animal played a role in them being overlooked for a while, or do you think there's another reason for that?
Oh, you're completely right. Spot on. It's
Yeah.
out of sight, out of
Out of
mind.
sight, out of mind.
They
Yeah. Hmm.
exactly. I mean, they don't howl, they don't roam around in big packs. They're just not as obvious, and so we tend to, are just how humans are a little more prone to like value things or have views or opinions about things are shaped by how often you're exposed to them, right? And I think with cougars, it just sort of there's not the same mythology with them, even just through human culture. I think like there is with wolves or bears, even there's not the same animosity or hatred, and I think a lot of that is influenced in part by the fact that people just never see them or rarely see them. And so that certainly is the case for Yellowstone. So we're trying to really promote them as an important animal here in the park through both our research and the data and the information we learn about them. But just again, I love giving talks to the public and sharing just video footage of them because it's like you just never see cougars out there. You're lucky if you get one glimpse in your lifetime, and
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
yeah,
Well,
so
it's just I'm so struck by the tremendous amount of work and effort it takes to do this work and collect all this incredible data. I mean, if I had managed to successfully uh, capture and collar any cougar that I'd seen in the park, that number would still be zero. So it's really remarkable to me. What, if anything, has surprised you the most in your time studying and living with cougars?
yeah. I think one thing is really important for people to understand about these carnivores, cougars, wolves, is just how challenging and their lives are, how difficult it is for them to do the basic things that they need to survive, hunting primarily. We've really tried to share what we've learned about hunting behavior in these animals and their success and their impacts on prey in a way that is we hope is useful for appreciating them more, learning to coexist with them, understanding whether or not they're having impacts on prey populations. And just for a cougar, it's just they're so tough, and their challenges of raising offspring and feeding themselves are quite impressive to see. And just cougar as a hunter is a stalking ambush hunter. They have, again, as I described at the beginning of our conversation, very powerful muscular body design, and that's key to their hunting success. Their method of hunting is to stalk and come up behind prey or up alongside prey and reach around and grab onto them. And they're usually trying to deliver a bite with their mouth on the neck, either the throat or the top of the head. They're doing it by themselves. They don't have help of other cougars, unlike wolves. They do have what we call supinating, like us, supinating wrists. They can rotate. They have retractable claws that come out. That is a real advantage over the wolf that literally just has its mouth. But the cougars can come up and grab, and so they're very powerful and strong. We actually think they are probably more successful per encounter than a wolf.
Mm, interesting.
Um, our research on wolves here, and we watched wolves hunt elk, thousands of times over the last 26 years, is they're only successful taking down a cow elk like maybe 15-20% of the time they attempt it. Very inefficient at what they do. It's been grossly misrepresented, sort of the hunting skill of a wolf. They're very much limited by their biology. They need vulnerable prey to be successful, and they can't kill anything they want. It's not easy. They don't kill for fun. Same thing with cougars, although I think cougars are slightly better than wolves at doing it because of their hunting style and their muscular strength and their ability to rotate and grab on. That said, it's still very dangerous and difficult. We've had cougars that we've been studying and following die from hunts. I remember this really prominent example back when I was working for Tony in the early 2000s of a male cougar we were following and doing predation work on out by Lamar Valley on Mount Norris. He came up and had attacked a bighorn ram, this full curl, at the top of a cliff. They both tumbled off the cliff, fell over 100 feet. The sheep hit the ground and literally popped when we came up on the scene. It's like heart was laying on the snow, blood everywhere. We were like, what the heck's going on here? Then we found the cougar with a broken back and compound fractures on his hind legs. And, he died from that hunting event. Again, just trying to get a meal. I handled collared a cougar a couple years ago, M211. We called him Snaggletooth because he had a broken and healed lower jaw, a missing upper canine. Their canines are their most
Yeah.
important tool for hunting, and it was totally missing. And we think he got kicked in the face during an elk hunt. He went on to live another 4 or 5 years. We had a female cougar that broke her hip, and we have her on camera multiple times with this broken hip, and yet she still had her 2 kittens she was hauling along with her. She was hunting and feeding them. She's gone on to heal from that broken hip. She's alive out there today. She's probably in
Wow.
my view shed over here on Mount Everest as I look out the window, doing her thing with her kittens, and she's fully healed. And that's a couple years ago this happened, and they're just tough. They
Yeah.
persevere through all those challenges. And I shouldn't say that's a surprise as much as just a deeper appreciation for these
Yeah.
animals and what they go
Right.
through. Yeah.
That is remarkable, and some of those stories are a little hard to hear, to be, to be honest. But
Yes. Yes.
I do
Yes.
remember when that incident with the cougar and the bighorn sheep happened, because the
Yeah.
photos of the aftermath of that were pretty widely circulated on the internet,
That's
because
right.
it was
Yeah.
startling to see
Yes.
this,
Yes.
this horrible demise of both animals at the end of what must have been a pretty wild, hunt, but pretty crazy. Okay, so curious about um, memorable experiences. So you have been in Yellowstone for many years now, presumably seen lots of things. Any really particularly memorable moments with cougars that you can share?
Yeah. I remember when I first started working on the Cougar Project, my first day in the field was probably the most physically challenging day I've ever had. Anyone that's studied cougars, anyone that's gone out with a houndsman, maybe in an area that not along a road to try to tree a cougar, not even to kill one, but just to see one up a tree. Anyone that's hiked in cougar country knows just how challenging that country is physically. But I remember my first day on the Cougar Project. It was in May of 2000. I went out with a long-term field biologist, Polly Biot, and we went from Gardner all the way up and over Deckard Flats, through Crevice Creek, up the other side. And the goal that day was to locate a cougar. And so we had to go find it. We heard the signals, and it took us all day to get there. And finally, at 3:30 in the afternoon, we got up to where we thought it was. And we kind of snuck up, and the signal was booming, clicking really loud in. And I look over and I see this male radio collar cougar just like basking in the sun under a tree in the late afternoon. And so we got the location, and then I turned around and hiked all the way back and got back after dark, and it was just too exhausted to eat. But it was sort of that first real exposure to cougar research, and I just fell in love. I mean, I had already been studying wolves for a few years at that time, and I love studying wolves, and it's fun to do both and see their similarities and differences. But I just, that first real experience out there as a biologist tracking a cougar was just, I'll never forget it. I went on to just continue to have those sorts of experiences. And, whether it be, I remember watching this mother cougar out one afternoon. We got a location on her. We were watching her from maybe, I don't know, 500-600 yards away. And, we're watching through binoculars. We'd hiked a couple hours to get to where she was. And it's great when you see them on those days, because then you don't have to, exactly where she was and what she was doing. But what she was doing is she had 2 little kittens, all maybe about 20, 25 pounds, and they were following her along and kind of falling off logs and scrambling up. And she kept turning around and chirping at them. They have,
Oh,
that's the one
yeah.
thing about cougar calls that people might not appreciate, is that we kind of think of cougar vocalizations as sort of, the movie, sort of the caterwaul or the scream, like, And they do that, and females caterwaul to attract mates, and so that does happen. But so much of their communication, particularly with their kittens, is chirping like birds. You probably heard a cougar vocalize out there if you spent a lot of time in Yellowstone country and didn't realize what it was, or maybe
Thought it
you
was a
do if
bird.
you thought it was a bird.
Hold out the
But they
bird
chirp.
identification
Yeah,
ad at them. They're like, oh, they can't find this
it's
one.
yeah, it's like a chipping sparrow. Like, chirp,
Yep.
chirp. And she was chirping at her kittens that basically say, stay there. I'm hunting. And what she was trying to do is hunt marmots. And so she had their kittens and she kept chirping on them. They'd follow her and she could go up to them and try to lead them back. And it's almost like she was scolding them, like, you're screwing up my hunt. And, she's kind of sent them back. And they finally did what, young cougars do, is they kind of tucked themselves under a log and they totally evaporated. And then she continued to hunt. And I watched her 2 or 3 times fail to get marmots who, of course, they were chirping too, giving their alarm
Mm-hmm.
calls. So
Mm-hmm.
that was just a real special situation. It wasn't the dramatic, like a cougar coming up and grabbing an elk and taking it down. It was like a female trying to feed her young kittens, taking advantage of whatever food resource was there. And marmots are a nice, fat little package of food to get, and they are successful getting them from time to time. And so that was really special. Gosh, I mean, there's just so many. When we do our captures, those are pretty intense experiences. We're out there, we're really focused on animal safety, whether it's the dogs that we work with, the people, because of just the intensity of trying to get close to cougars and get them up trees and safely dart them and lower them. But I've had a lot of close encounters with cougars in those situations. And I think what's resonates with me is just the visual connection you make with an animal in that situation where they're up in a tree. And it's really amazing about cougars, and has to be just an evolved response, is they act really calm. They kind of go in this zen state when they're up in a tree. People think of it as probably a stressful situation, and there's no doubt there's stress involved, and the animal is, who knows internally what's going on. But they sit there. Oftentimes they take a nap while you're messing around with your darts and getting ready to do it. And they just sit there and then they look up at you. But when you make that eye connection with a cougar at close range like that, it's just, they stare right through you. And as the biologist, you look at them and you say thank you, you say sorry. It's sort of a
Yeah.
contract you have with them that they
Yeah.
don't totally appreciate, and you just have to be, this is something that we hope will help your species in the long term. You're going to teach us a lot. We're going to put a collar on you. The collars we use now, we can blow them off remotely once they've collected enough data.
Really?
So we sometimes we capture them because we do long-term study in individuals. But just a month ago, I went out and triggered a blow off on a female that we had collared for a couple of years. The collar collected 2 years of great data, served its purpose. We went out and triggered the blow off, and it fell off the cat on the ground, and she went off into the woods without a collar. And those are really special moments when you, as a biologist, have learned something from an animal. And again, you hope it feeds into the bigger picture of teaching others about this animal and why they're important. And then you say so long and good luck.
Yeah. Thank you for your
And
service.
But those moments are special for me, and not many people get them, and I'm very lucky to have had those through time. So
Yeah. Well, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing those stories with
yeah.
us. So possibly the most important question of the day, because we want your official scientific opinion on this, which is, what do you think is the cutest? Cougar kittens, grizzly bear cubs, or wolf pups?
Oh, hands down, cougar kittens.
Okay, good. Right answer.
Hands down.
That's what I was going to say
Hands
too.
down.
I
I
don't
mean,
think
they've
I'm
got those.
biased, but
They're just, the spots, the blue eyes, that just little fuzzy face, the whole thing. And our earlier work that was done here in Yellowstone did a fair bit, because this was a big part of the question of marking kittens. So you'd figure out where the female had their den. You'd go in, you'd wait for her to leave. You'd go in and handle these little kittens, and you put little expandable radio collars on them and get blood samples for genetics and disease. And so that was pretty cool to see little kittens up close. We don't do that with our work now. We kind of leave kittens alone. It's not really a question for our research. In the first couple of years I started the study, we were doing it a little bit. And oh yeah, I'll just never forget their smell, their look, their fuzziness. Yeah, they're.
fuzziness.
I mean, their cubs and wolf cubs are cute too, but I
Yeah,
think
of course.
hands down, the cougars got it. So.
It'd just be so hard, I imagine, to stay really, objective in that moment. You just want to like give them just a little cuddle real quick. Well,
Yes,
nobody's looking.
yes, yes. You do it,
um,
no one knows. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. That's for science. Just smelling their head for science. um,
Uh,
One other question that we do like to ask all of our guests, and you did mention a few specific names throughout our conversation, but do you have any particular sort of science or conservation hero, perhaps who inspired you, in your younger years, or just really anybody that you look up to?